One, two. Can you hear me through your earphones? Can you hear me through your earphones? All right, this may work.
The other thing we can do is set up a witness mic.
Committee will come to order. Good morning. Before we start today, I want to take a moment to speak about the shooting that occurred yesterday morning at our practice for today's congressional baseball game. Our prayers continue to be with everyone who's injured, members, staff, friends, and first responders. That includes Majority Whip Steve Scalise, a roommate of mine and Eric Paulson's, and a widely respected leader in Congress. And we're deeply grateful, all of us, for the actions taken yesterday by Capitol Police officers to protect our friends, our colleagues in the surrounding community. Again, to all those who are injured, we're all praying for your swift and successful recovery. Now, let's begin. Today, our committee will consider two pieces of bipartisan legislation. One focuses on economic security, promoting more opportunities for Americans to get back to work. The other is focusing on strengthening our nation's energy security. Due to scheduling constraints, we'll not be marking up the 5 bipartisan child welfare bills previously planned for action this week. These 5 bipartisan bills were all provisions of the Family First Prevention Services Act passed last year by our committee in the House, but not the Senate. We appreciate the cooperation of our Democratic colleagues in advancing these bills, and will continue to work with the Majority Leader, schedule their consideration by the whole House soon. As I mentioned, we have 2 bills on the docket today. The first is H.R. 2842, the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act, bipartisan legislation sponsored by Congressman Curbelo and Davis to help more Americans get back to work. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are more than 6 million job openings, the highest level since the government started tracking this data in 2000. At the same time, the share of Americans participating in the workforce is near a 4-decade low. So the question is, how can we bridge the gap? How do we connect out-of-work Americans with all the employers who want and need to fill these job openings? As Human Resource Subcommittee has heard time and time again, one of the most effective answers to this problem is employer-driven, on-the-job training for workers, and that's exactly what is provided by the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act. Our second bill is H.R. 1551, bipartisan tax legislation authored by Congressman Rice and Blumenauer. This bill clarifies an issue in existing law to help ensure the effective operation of the tax credit for nuclear energy production. It addresses an urgent problem that now poses a threat to our nation's energy security and, by extension, our national security. As a result of uncertainty surrounding the current structure of this tax credit, there's a risk of construction grinding to a halt on several cutting-edge nuclear power plants in our country. Meanwhile, our international competitors are moving ahead on nuclear power to bolster their own energy sector. Nuclear power is a critical component of an all-above strategy for energy independence and national security. It is urgent we take action to solve this issue in our tax code and provide the certainty that our energy innovators need to continue moving forward with construction. I want to thank Congressman Rice and Blumenauer for leading the charge on this vital effort. I want to thank Congressman Curbelo and Davis, Dr. Davis, for their work to help Americans get back to work. I want to thank all the members on both sides of the aisle who crafted the child welfare bills we will continue to advance in the coming days. These are important bills to help the American people, and they are all worthy of bipartisan support. This time I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neal, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And just before I begin my formal comments, I want you to know that we identify entirely with the suggestions that you made about our colleague, Congressman Scalise, the Capitol Police, and the staff members who were wounded yesterday. And we will be at that game tonight, I think, as a reinforcement of our determination to go forward. So thank you, Chairman Brady, and I'm glad to work with you today to advance 5 child welfare bills to the House floor. I'm also pleased that the committee is considering today 2 bills, one that addresses strategies for helping TANF recipients improve their skills and find good jobs, and another regarding the production tax credit for advanced nuclear power. I'd like to begin with a few comments about the child welfare bills. I want to applaud Mr. Davis for his efforts on H.R. 2742, the Modernizing the Interstate Placement of Children in Foster Care Act, H.R. 2834, the Partnership Grants to Strengthen Families Affected by Parental Substance Abuse Act, and also 2842, the Accelerating Individuals into Employment Act, which I will discuss in greater depth in a moment. I also want to commend Congresswoman Judy Chu, an excellent new member of our committee, for her work as co-author of H.R. 2857, the Supporting Families in Substance Abuse Act. Congressman Terry Sewell similarly deserves great praise for her work developing H.R. 2866, the Reducing Barriers for Relative Foster Parents Act. And finally, a word of thanks to Congressman Karen Bass, a colleague who does not serve on our committee but has a strong commitment to helping young people in foster care. She spearheaded Democratic efforts on H.R. 2847, the Improving Services for Older Youth in Foster Care Act. This morning, we are taking up H.R. 2842, the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act. It would fund demonstration projects to explore approaches that combine work and training to ensure that low-income parents receiving temporary assistance for needy families can get a good job that will lift their families into the middle class. Democrats have long supported these approaches, and research shows they can be very effective. I expect my colleagues will join Mr. Davis in promoting this good research. Many in this room would agree that in some significant ways, TANF is still failing families. I'm concerned that this failure would certainly not be solved by the administration's proposal to arbitrarily cut TANF by $22 billion over the next decade. TANF currently serves only about 1 in 4 poor families, and states spend less than half of their TANF funds on TANF core purposes: work, child care, and assistance to families. Specifically related to H.R. 2842, TANF puts states at risk of financial penalties if they help too many parents upgrade their education or their skills, including participating in programs that H.R. 2842 proposes to support. We should gather additional evidence of what works to help struggling parents find good jobs and move out of poverty. We should also look at the bigger picture and remove obstacles from states when it comes to education and training for TANF recipients. As I conclude, let me thank the chairman also for considering my colleague Mr. Blumenauer's legislation that would modify the production tax credit for nuclear power facilities. This bipartisan legislation also is a big priority for Representatives Clyburn and Rice, as this is critical to jobs in the state of South Carolina. However, I must also highlight my disappointment that we're not acting on other priorities in the energy tax space. For example, there's bipartisan interest on this committee for extending the Section 48 investment tax credit for non-solar Section 48 eligible technologies. The U.S. government spends a tremendous amount of money on energy policy through our tax code, and therefore, as we continue our discussions on tax reform, I hope the chairman will consider focusing on comprehensive energy reform as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Neal. Our first order of business, H.R. 2842, the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act. I'll turn the sponsor bill, Mr. Curbelo, to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Brady, and thank you to Ranking Member Neal as well for together bringing this bill, the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act, before the committee today. And thank you, Congressman Davis, for being my partner on the legislation and for all your work in this space. While we have made some progress helping individuals and families lift themselves out of poverty, there are clear indications that we can do more. The American people deserve opportunities that will help them improve their circumstances. The federal government spends more than $500 billion each year on measures to combat poverty. Despite this large investment, there are still over 43 million people living in poverty in our country. The number of Americans who live in areas that have severely concentrated poverty has nearly doubled over the last decade to an historic high of 14 million. In these areas, at least 40% of families live below the poverty line. Today, 13.5% of Americans live in poverty. When the war on poverty began, this number was around 15%. We can do more to help American families. Through innovative proposals like the bills we are considering today, we can make a difference and improve the lives of individuals throughout the country. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 2842, the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act, incentivizes employer partnerships with state and local agencies to hire recipients from the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. This bill uses $100 million from the TANF Contingency Fund to create grants so states can conduct demonstration projects intended to assist low-income individuals in entering the workforce and maintaining employment. This bill also empowers local communities by giving them the ability to control how TANF dollars are spent. Instead of an inflexible Washington-designed program, this legislation is reflective of the fact that every community has unique challenges that present barriers to finding a job. The Secretary of Health and Human Services is authorized through this legislation to make grants to states. These grants will be used to implement demonstration projects that will evaluate strategies to help low-income individuals gain employment and, just as importantly, keep it. This legislation requires that states meet certain criteria to ensure that the programs are effective. This includes a description of how local governments will coordinate these efforts with others that assist low-income individuals. States will also be required to report on the outcomes of the demonstration projects and provide evaluations to determine whether the partnerships were effective. The measured outcomes will include the efficacy of each project in moving people into the workforce, helping them retain employment, and increasing their earnings over time. Poverty is an issue that affects each of our districts. We need innovative solutions that can help get people on track to a brighter future, and this legislation is definitely a step in the right direction. Mr. Chairman, work, a job, is something that dignifies the human condition. It is everyone's opportunity to make their contribution to society, to their community, and to our country. So I encourage all of the members of this committee to vote in favor of H.R. 2842, the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act, to help people get on their own path to success. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Corbello. I now turn to Dr. Davis for purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And my staff and I have been very pleased to work with Representative Corbello and his staff as we seek to find solutions to some of the most pressing problems that exist in our country, and that is the problem of millions of individuals who are out of work, which means that their sense of hopelessness as they continue to experience this condition increases. Finding ways to modernize TANF and make it more efficient as well as more effective has long been an approach that Democrats, not only on this committee, but throughout the Congress, have sought to achieve. Research is clear. Subsidized employment and career pathways successfully engage people in employment, especially those who've been unsuccessful in finding paid employment through their efforts. Further research on past TANF subsidized employment programs documents that these initiatives increase employment and earning, both while individuals worked in a subsidized job as well as after the program ended. I'd also like to mention the fact that Democrats, but certainly Representative Gwen Moore from Wisconsin, has worked on this issue intently and initially proposed allowing subsidized employment in TANF via her RISE Act many years ago. I embraced her idea in my Responsible Fatherhood bill, and I'm pleased to join with Representative Corbello in this effort. Finally, having research projects, having resources to test out theories and put them into practice to see what actually works. We've had some experience with that in Illinois, especially under the leadership of then Governor Pat Quinn, who had a rather expansive effort that he still touts as long as he can, even though he's no longer the governor. So again, it's just been a pleasure working with Mr. Corbello and his staff, and I certainly would urge all members of the committee to support this effort, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 2842. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in the nature of substitute which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Anda Cesaro, the Staff Director for the Human Resources Subcommittee, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after our presentation. Mr. Cesaro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Neal. H.R. 2842, the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act, encourages employer-led partnerships to help people move from welfare to work. Under this bill, up to $100 million is reserved from the TANF Contingency Fund to subsidize the wages of temporary assistance for needy family recipients for up to 12 months. Within that, there's a reservation of 15% to fund programs that offer career pathway services. As reflected on the green sheet distributed previously, the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute modifies H.R. 2842 as introduced by clarifying the title under Section 2 to now read Demonstration Projects to Support Subsidized Employment for TANF Recipients to Enter the Workforce. It also requires the report specifically be sent to House Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee, which have jurisdiction over TANF. Mr. Chairman, that completes my walkthrough, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Doggett.
Thank you very much. The chairman began by saying we've heard about these problems over and over again. Is it also true we've had this bill before?
That is correct, sir. It was marked up last year.
Basically the same bill with the amendments now incorporated that were adopted there, presented again.
Correct. In the last Congress, it was H.R. 2990, and there were amendments, and those have been incorporated into the introduced version of this bill.
We approved it in May, and was it ever presented on the floor?
It was not.
Were any of the bills that were approved to address changes, save, I think, pay for success, the other 5 were never presented on the floor, were they?
Yes, they were. There was the Social Impact Partnership
That's
bill.
the only one out of 6.
Yes, that included portions of other bills that were marked up on TANF, including the What Works Clearinghouse and the extension of the program, which eventually became law.
Does the instant bill we're considering today propose to amend a fund that President Trump has proposed to abolish?
The president's budget does include a cut to the TANF
So if the
program.
president's successful, this legislation really will have no merit at all.
This Congress actually acted at the end of April to extend the TANF program, including the contingency fund, through the end of fiscal year 2018.
So it could cover through the end, when does that end?
Through the end of 2018, so through next year. So not
this may
just
be
the
a
end of the
bill,
fiscal year.
if the president's successful, that will last for a year.
This bill is only intended to last for a year.
Only a year of help. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to question Mr. Cesaro? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Oh, Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
I believe we should support this bill, but 2 things. First, the president, and this picks up the statement of Mr. Doggett, the president's budget would cut workforce development by 39%. By 39%. And so I think we ought to be forthright about what we're doing. Essentially, this is a step forward, but if his budget were adopted, it would be many, many, many steps backwards. Secondly, Mr. Corbella, you talk about discretion. In the TANF bill, states have considerable discretion, and the problem with that use of discretion is that they've been using their discretion to spend lots of money unrelated to the core purposes of the legislation that we worked on long ago and some of us supported, the basic reform bill. After making amendments to it, and we've tried to amend it further since then to make it workable and to have the core purposes implemented. So when we laud state flexibility in this area, we need to take an honest look at what's happened with state flexibility, indeed, even in relationship to the core purposes of TANF. Because I think we're going to be discussing this later, many states have essentially undermined the use of funds for TANF instead of for core purposes, for other purposes, some of which may be laudatory but do not directly relate to the purposes of TANF. And I just want to go back and emphasize, as we vote for this, I hope that all of us will lean in the appropriation process and convince the Appropriation Committee to reject the proposed 39% cut in workforce development that came from the President, because if that were to pass, this bill, which is for 1 year, would have much and close to all of its purposes overshadowed by this cut in workforce development. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Doggett, you recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a peculiar bill. It proposes to direct how $100 million of a fund that President Trump proposes to abolish should be allocated. It is an unusual bill also because it is the same bill that this committee considered last May on a bipartisan basis. I offered an amendment that was adopted at that time, and at that time it was a much heralded accomplishment of the committee. In fact, the majority on May 11th issued a press release that said, "Committee takes action to help families escape poverty." And on May 24th, when the committee hearing continued, Ways and Means takes step to help low-income Americans climb the economic ladder. Well, there may be somebody who's climbed the economic ladder since last year or escaped poverty, but it's not the result of anything this committee did, because the measures that were considered in the committee, same ones that are being considered today, were not presented on the floor. And of course, there's the question of why it was we considered 6 different bills instead of one major reform of TANF, and that was for the very simple reason that while today we're particularly concerned with taking bipartisan action, we weren't concerned then about taking bipartisan reform. And the TANF legislation was specifically split into 6 pieces so that no Democrat could offer more general reforms, or for that matter, Republicans, because it's not only Democratic ideas that need to be considered here. Mr. Renacci and Mr. Teaberry in 2015 came up with a very good idea to provide a reasonable opportunity for those who are receiving TANF assistance to obtain additional education and training so that they can secure a job for their family that will be more than just another minimum wage dead end will actually get them somewhere. But those ideas couldn't be presented, and they cannot be presented today. There seems to be a lack of true commitment to changing welfare to workfare. It's not been working the way it has operated the last 20 years. It had some initial accomplishments, but it's not been achieving its true objectives. As for flexibility, this is not a bill about flexibility. It's about a bill about limiting what the states can do with $100 million. The states can do subsidized employment today. They can do pathways today if they think that those programs have merit. This takes $100 million and provides specific restraints on what the states can do with that $100 million. This year, President Trump continues a great tradition of helping poor people to escape poverty by blaming them and investing less to get them into livable wage jobs. His budget cuts temporary assistance for needy families. We're messing around with $100 million. He cuts it by $22 billion. And as if that weren't enough, on child care alone, which is so vital to single working mothers to be able to go out and get a livable wage job, he proposes not 1, but 3 cuts to child care and would reduce child care funding by over $400 million per year. So we can, in Washington terms, tinker or tweak with a substantial sum, $100 million, but it is tinkering or tweaking with a tiny percentage. I think it works out to less than 0.5% that we're looking at here today, as if we were having a major accomplishment while he's out there trying to undermine the whole program. This particular bill, I think, reflects a lack of overall commitment to making work opportunities for those who are trying to escape poverty. If we do a better job of providing education and training, backing them up with programs like Project Quest in San Antonio, Capital Idea in Austin, that are trying to link them up to in-demand jobs, then we have a chance
for people to have more than a dead-end job where they have limited benefits, limited pay and hours, and find themselves right back in the cycle of poverty. So I'd like to see us doing something that is much more comprehensive than tinkering around the edges and really live up to the commitment of trying to get people out of poverty by giving them the opportunity to get the job that will let them provide a living wage for their family. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. The committee will now recess momentarily and reconvene at approximately 11:15 or soon thereafter. Thanks. The meeting will come back to order. The chair recognizes Mr. Pasquarel to strike the last word.
Pasquarel will be back shortly, so could we maybe go
Let's go back to Representative, I had Representative Sewell next. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Neal for working with us to move forward with the 5 bipartisan bills on child welfare and foster care. I want to take this time to talk about the importance of foster care and to thank Representative Smucker of Pennsylvania, as well as the rest of the committee members for all of their help on foster care. Representative Smucker and I partnered to introduce H.R. 2866, the Reducing Barriers for Relative Foster Parents Act, and we look forward to it arriving on the floor. Last month, like many of you, I participated in the Foster Youth Shadow Day. I was lucky enough to be joined by a bright young lady from Birmingham, Alabama named Khadijah Moore. Khadijah is a true foster care success story. After spending much of her childhood in the foster care system, she just graduated from Alabama State University. However, her path to success was filled with unbelievable hardship, and she continues to face many obstacles today. Our nation's foster youth are one of the most vulnerable populations in our society, and too often we fail to protect and support these children. We in Congress can and must do more. That is why I'm proud to introduce H.R. 2866, and I am grateful to this committee for supporting it. This is a common sense piece of legislation that has strong bipartisan support here in the House, as well as support groups all around the country. This bill would motivate states to update their foster care licensing regulations to encourage the placement of children with relatives rather than with non-relative foster parents. It seems like a no-brainer that kids should be placed with family members wherever possible. However, many states have outdated regulations that make it overly burdensome for family members to become foster parents. Some states have not updated their licensing requirements in years, while other states' licensing requirements unintentionally discourage foster youth from being placed with family members. In some states, it is not required that relatives be notified when a child enters the foster care system. In these cases, a grandparent or other relative may be willing and able to care for the child, but the child ends up in a foster home or group home because no one contacted the next of kin. Because we do not want to have a foster care, because today we don't have a foster care witness testifying, I wanted to share with this committee the testimony of one foster youth, Lexi Gruber, who testified during a Senate financing hearing on May 19, 2015. Lexi stated, quote, "I believed that DCF was going to find me a loving home. At first, I was placed with my uncle. Being in a familiar and loving environment helped me begin to heal from both my stressful childhood and entry into the foster system. 2 months later, my social worker informed me that my relative's home did not have enough bedrooms to meet the agency's regulations, and I would have to be removed from his home. A waiver could have been filed so that I could remain in my uncle's home, but department policies carried more weight than permanency. My social worker did not listen to my pleas to stay with my relative. Instead, she picked me up from his home and dropped me off at an emergency youth shelter. When I moved in, the staff watched me as I struggled to carry my trash bags filled with my belongings. I collapsed onto my new bed, a graffiti-covered bed frame in a filthy room. I had lost everything, and now I was homeless," end quote. This is just one example of why it's imperative that states update their licensing regulations and ensure that foster children can be placed with family members wherever possible. Research shows that when children are placed with family members, they have better outcomes. When children are placed with relatives like grandparents, they experience fewer school changes and are less likely to re-enter the foster care system. Mr. Chairman, again, I want to thank you and Ranking Member Neal, Representative Smucker, and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for supporting this common sense regulation. Finally, I want to give a quick shout out to my friend and colleague, Representative Karen Bass, and voice my support for her bill, H.R. 2847, the Improving Services for Older Youth in Foster Care. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I think it's really important that we work together in a bipartisan way to support our children all across this nation, especially those in foster care. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Sewell. Representative Chu, you're recognized.
Ms. Chu is away for the moment. Trying to get her.
Mr. Smith, earlier you had indicated an interest in speaking to strike the last word. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I hope that as we kind of listen to each other on both sides up here, that we will engage in this budget process as a legislative branch that I think we are incumbent to do. How important that is. I know that the Budget Committee is working right now to fashion a budget that I think is reflective of what the legislative branch would choose to do, and I would hope that we can all engage in that moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So are there, does anyone else wish to strike the last word?
Oh,
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Davis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move to strike the last word. What I really want to do is I want to thank Mr. Smith and all of the members of the Human Resources Committee for our ability to work through these 5 bills that we've been talking about. I support all 5 of them because they make important changes to support children and families. I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure that we enact the Families First Act, from which these important child welfare provisions are drawn. The Family First Act begins a fundamental shift in federal child welfare policy to preserving families rather than separating them. I'm firmly committed to continuing to work bipartisanly to doing all that I can, and certainly, hopefully, all that we can, to make sure that families in America get all of the support and assistance that we can provide, and especially to those who contain children. And so again, I thank Mr. Smith. I commend him for his leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Ms. Delveni is recognized for purposes of offering her amendment. The gentlelady would suspend. Thank you. Now, the gentlelady is recognized for purposes of offering her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is a common sense way to support a particularly effective workforce development model that has bipartisan support in Congress and in the White House, apprenticeships. And I hope that all members of this committee can support it, and I'd like to thank Congressman Reichert for co-sponsoring this amendment. Helping people find long-term employment in a high-demand industry is one of the best ways to ensure that everyone has economic security. Apprenticeships and on-the-job training are an important part of that equation. And we know that apprenticeships can be an incredible opportunity for businesses and workers alike. They allow employers to build a pipeline of qualified workers while equipping job seekers with the specific skills they need to find and keep good-paying jobs. Oftentimes, they provide skills that are portable and meaningful anywhere in the country, giving workers more freedom to transfer between companies and industries. In today's evolving economy, this kind of portability is crucial. Apprenticeships have been shown to increase workers' earnings potential in both the short term and in the long term. And in my home state of Washington, public investments in apprenticeship programs have been demonstrated to give a higher return on investment than any other workforce development program. According to our Workforce Training and Education Coordinating Board, these programs offer a net benefit to taxpayers of $85,000 per apprentice over the course of their lifetimes. So that's a return of $23 for every $1 invested by the public. It's important to remember that these smart investments not only have an incredible effect on our economy, but also on people's lives by ensuring that they have good-paying jobs and careers. Providing our constituents with better workforce training options shouldn't be a partisan issue. This is something both sides of the aisle have come together on before through policies like the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. and we should continue to build on that progress. We need a national commitment to addressing the skills gap through federal policies that promote apprenticeships and meet the needs of an evolving 21st century workforce. This is particularly true as technological advancements like automation continue to dramatically shift how our economy works today. For all of these reasons, I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Riker, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Despite more than 6 million job openings in this country, we have a record number of individuals not participating in our labor force. Worse, business is looking to hire more and more workers who have the skills necessary to meet industry demands, but plenty of Americans are just not prepared. This amendment looks to bridge the gap, focusing on helping low-income Americans gain the necessary skills while working on the job, helping them to earn and learn at the same time. Not every job requires a 4-year degree, but more than half of jobs in the United States do require some form of education and training beyond high school. Apprenticeships are one important strategy for meeting the needs of both businesses and workers. I am pleased to support this amendment with my colleague from Washington State and urge my colleagues on the committee to support this amendment as well as the underlying bill. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Riker. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the amendment. I think it is the kind of innovation that will be helpful in getting people out of poverty and into the middle class. I believe that our objective should be to encourage innovation without wasting taxpayer money on interventions that are not cost-effective, that just don't work. There's not enough TANF block grant money available now to adequately fund existing programs designed to help poor people secure stable employment. And if President Trump and his allies are successful, there will be a lot less. TANF has not been adjusted for inflation in 20 years, and it continues to serve a smaller and smaller share of families. Since no additional resources are being added by this bill or any other measure before the committee to help lift people out of poverty, we're really in a zero-sum game situation. Every dollar that gets shifted into subsidized employment means a dollar less for some other initiative. Overall, the evidence is rather modest and mixed as to whether subsidized employment actually is effective in helping the poor secure a stable job at a wage that helps them escape poverty. Certainly, the offer of free or almost free taxpayer-financed labor would have appeal to many businesses. But the question is whether when the taxpayer subsidy runs out, does the job run out also? Or does it truly open the way to long-term employment? And the amendment that has just been offered with apprenticeship programs offers more opportunity for that long-term employment than some forms of subsidized employment that are out there, and that's why I support it. Does subsidized employment offer opportunity or just another taxpayer-financed bit of cheap labor? The verdict is undecided, but this amendment would help answer that verdict in an appropriate way. Mr. Chairman, the broader problem here in this bill and with this approach is with the overall question of whether we will place an emphasis on work as the best way to get out of poverty. I personally voted for the 1966 welfare reform law because I believe that was the best approach. And in some ways, that law has fulfilled its promise to end welfare as we know it, but not as we were promised. It has basically changed welfare as we knew it in 1996 to what is largely a welfare program for Republican state governors. They take federal dollars, they use them to fill budget gaps. They do not supplement those federal dollars or use them in creative ways to try to protect the poverty grant and to correct the poverty gap that exists out there. And so it grows. And there are many attacks on President Johnson's war on poverty. Clearly, there were some shortcomings in it, but overall, with Medicaid, with the Job Corps, with Head Start, with so many of the programs that were a part of that initiative, many people were helped. And what we need to be doing now, instead of having what is essentially a war on the impoverished instead of a war on poverty, is to try to identify where the shortcomings were, learn from them, learn from the successes, and develop an overall reform of the welfare system that is focused on how we can do more apprenticeship programs and other initiatives that will get people into the jobs that will allow them to support their family and to climb up the economic ladder into the middle class. And as we do that, we will assure not only individual opportunity for millions of Americans who thought they never could overcome the conditions they were in, but we're in a country where one of the major obstacles to growth is workplace shortage, workforce shortage in many industries. And so working through apprenticeship programs, through targeted employment programs like Project Quest, we have the hope in a genuine welfare reform of being able to make America more competitive at the same time that we provide more opportunity for some of our most disadvantaged Americans. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pasquarello, Ms. Chu, you had indicated an interest to strike the last word, but there's an opportunity to speak on the amendment as well. If you'd like to be recognized.
Thank you,
Mr. Pasquarello.
I'm sorry I had to drop out for a few moments, but I support, if I may go back, Mr. Chairman, the H.R. 2842. I will vote for it. However, I can't ignore what the President's budget would do to temporary assistance for needy families, the TANF program, and a slew of other programs that low-income families rely on. Now, the budget would cut TANF, that block grant, by 10% and eliminate the TANF contingency fund. That's a total of $2.2 billion. This is an important program that helps pregnant women and families with kids with basic expenses. TANF benefits have not kept pace with inflation. Those are the facts. And that means that many families that are living in poverty are not actually eligible for the program. And the cut proposed in the budget, President's budget, would mean a $39 million decrease in TANF funds for my home state of New Jersey every year. This committee can consider bills like the ones before us today to make improvements around the margins, but none of that matters if we then turn around and take a sledgehammer to the programs when it's time to consider the budget. In the same vein, when I originally co-sponsored the Family First Prevention Services Act, which included a number of bills we're discharging from this committee today, I'm very proud to support the House passage of the Family First Prevention Services Act last year. It's my hope that the concerns of this bill can be addressed in the Senate. However, I also cannot ignore the fact that a little more than a month ago, members of the general body passed the American Health Care Act, which would decimate Medicaid, a program that many families and children in foster care rely on for important health care services, including mental health coverage. The budget of the President doubles down on those AHCA cuts and piles on, cutting the program by as much as $1.3 trillion. You want to talk about mean? That's mean. Harmful proposals like per capita caps and block grants will force states to make different choices about whether to maintain coverage for its residents or how to make up those cuts. Many families come into contact with the child welfare system. You got to sit there, Mr. Chairman, you have to sit in the welfare office and listen to those families that have children. Many issues. related to substance abuse even, and mental health. Many of them rely on the coverage Medicaid provides for these essential services. So I support the bills before us today, Mr. Chairman. I'm thankful that you gave me this opportunity to speak, but I urge my colleagues to look at the big picture. I think it's well worth it. And back to you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Chu, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, of course, support this amendment, and I'd also like to take this opportunity to talk about the issues pertaining to Family First legislation, as well as H.R. 2857, the Supporting Families in Substance Abuse Treatment Act. I appreciate the committee's attention to these important child welfare issues, particularly on foster care. And I'd like to note that advocates from my state and in my district have raised some concerns with the broader Family First legislation. While these concerns do not pertain to the bipartisan legislation that I will speak on today, I want to make sure that these concerns are addressed when the package is considered by this committee. I remain committed to ensuring that the Family First bill contains policy that's good for children and families and is something everybody can support. And now let me say a few words about H.R. 2857. Over the past few years, we've seen a rise in the number of children in foster care. This tragic situation is due in part, according to many experts, to the opioid epidemic that's affected so many of our states. According to one estimate compiled from health agencies across the country, drug overdoses may now be the leading cause of death among Americans under the age of 50. As more parents become addicted to opioids and require substance abuse treatment, children are often placed into foster care settings apart from their families. In fact, studies have shown that between a third and two-thirds of children enter foster care at least partly because of parental substance abuse. One model of treatment, called family-based substance abuse treatment, can be better for both parents and children. Family-based substance abuse treatment allows parents and children to stay together and receive services targeted to benefit the whole family. Rigorous research studies found that parents who utilized family-based residential treatment had higher success rates, lower relapse rates, and were less likely to need intervention from Child Protective Services in the family. Family-based treatment also reduces trauma for children by decreasing the number of times they have to be separated from their parents or other caregivers in a way that still keeps them safe. In my district of Los Angeles, we have a program called the Exodus Program, where formerly homeless families live on-site apartment complexes and receive comprehensive services, including substance abuse treatment, counseling, child development, and family reunification services. Over the last 7 years, more than 80% of enrolled families have completed the program, and 95% have been able to keep their families together. Even though we know that parent-child substance abuse models like Exodus have shown promising results, current law does not financially incentivize states to use them. A state can receive a federal match of 50% or more if they place a foster care eligible child with a foster family, while the parent separately seeks treatment. However, if a state places a parent and child in an evidence-based family substance abuse treatment program, they do not receive any federal reimbursement for the child's living costs. This bill would correct that imbalance, ensuring that states place parents and children in these programs and that they can receive the full federal match for the child's living costs. States would retain full authority to decide which placement was best for the child. This bill would simply remove the financial disincentive to keep the families together. More importantly, under this bill, family residential substance abuse treatment would become a foster care placement option. If the residential program was not successful and the child needed to be placed with the foster family away from the parent, there would not be a new determination of eligibility and children would remain eligible for federally funded foster care. States should be given the option to use family-based treatment options without risking the loss of federal foster care reimbursement. Keeping children in the care of their parents while they seek treatment can increase family bonding, child attachment, and family functioning while minimizing the trauma of separation for children. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation, and I yield back.
The question is on the amendment On agreeing the amendment offered by Ms. Dolbeni and Mr. Reichert, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. Seeing no further amendments, questions on the adoption amendment in the nature of substitute as amended, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute as amended is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Reichert for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 2842 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 2842 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those no. Opposed, no. Being the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 2842 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and the members have 2 additional days to file with committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next and final order of business is H.R. 1551 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to modify the credit for production from advanced nuclear power facilities. I recognize the bill sponsor, Mr. Rice, for purposes of an opening statement.
Chairman Brady, thank you for scheduling today's markup. I'd also like to thank my friend from Oregon, Congressman Blumenauer, for his continued leadership on this important legislation. Last Congress, this committee marked up identical legislation to the bill we're considering today, reporting it out of committee on a bipartisan vote. While the legislation and the need for it have remained the same, the future of nuclear energy production has changed dramatically. For that reason, I ask you to again approve this legislation, not because it makes common sense changes to the credit, but because of the extreme sense of urgency to provide certainty for the newest nuclear reactors in our country. Almost 12 years ago, Congress established the nuclear production tax credit as part of the energy policy of 2005. At that time, Congress designed the new nuclear production tax credit to jumpstart a nuclear industry that had been dormant for over 30 years. More importantly, Congress set out to limit the amount that the tax code would subsidize for these facilities, creating a national production capacity that effectively capped the amount of this credit available. South Carolina and Georgia responded to this incentive, making large investments in nuclear facilities that represented the pinnacle of safety and innovation in the industry. After years of applications, planning, and rigorous oversight by multiple regulatory authorities, these plants began construction in 2013, receiving sizable allocations of the nuclear production tax credit's national capacity. Yet it quickly became clear changes to the underlying provisions were necessary in order for these plants to fulfill the capacity allocation as Congress originally intended. For example, right now, not-for-profit entities like public utilities are unable to utilize or transfer their share of the credits, leaving the majority of these tax credits allocated to these 2 plants unusable. Additionally, the strict placed-in-service date would force these plants to make decisions between finishing before a deadline or making sure they are constructed in the safest way possible. Recently, to make matters worse, a third-party contractor for both plants unexpectedly filed for bankruptcy, putting the projects in jeopardy of finishing before the placed-in-service date, if at all. In the coming weeks, both plants must go before state regulators and provide a plan for how they will continue construction. The full availability of the $2 billion in tax credits will be a key factor in the regulator's assessment of whether to approve plans to continue with these facilities or shut down construction completely. Passing this legislation is more important now than ever. If these facilities shut down tomorrow, it will immediately cost 12,000 jobs in South Carolina and Georgia. It will cost individual ratepayers hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in increases in their annual utility bills. And most alarming, our national security will be jeopardized as countries like China and Russia continue to make massive investments in carbon-free nuclear power while we sit on the sidelines. We need to give these plants the certainty of the tax credits as Congress originally intended, not just for South Carolina and Georgia, but for the continued innovation of carbon-free nuclear energy and the security of our nation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. I now recognize Mr. Blumenauer for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an area that I have been involved with for some time. There is one aspect of this dealing with small-scale modular nuclear facilities is a technology that was developed at Oregon State University some 10 years ago and shows great promise. Being able to have a small-scale modular effort, easier to install, faster to construct, having a passive technology that is safer, not having the Takashima problem that we saw in Japan. We all are taking a hard look at what's going to happen with the balance of energy production in this country. We are facing issues of shutdown of that's scheduled for some nuclear plants that will actually result in an increase in carbon pollution in the future. I think being able to proceed with these elements helps in terms of the issue that my friend from South Carolina talked about. It'll also promote the development of this smaller scale, very efficient technology, which could have, I think, broad application and is worth our pursuing as we think about how to have a low carbon energy. We're going to need to have all our tools available. I think this is an important tool to have, and I'm happy to support it and look forward to working with my friend, Mr. Rice, as we bring this across the finish line.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1551. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time I offer an amendment in the nature substitute which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purposes of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, the Chief of Staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Neal, the members of the committee have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 28 and 29, which describe H.R. 1551 and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. By way of quick background, under present law, eligible taxpayers may claim a 1.8 cent per kilowatt hour production tax credit for production from qualified advanced nuclear facilities. This is an allocated credit. To be eligible to claim this credit, a taxpayer must have received an allocation from a 6,000 megawatt national limitation allocated by the Secretary of Treasury, and the facility has to have been placed in service prior to January 1st of 2021. The underlying legislation as amended by the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute would make two changes to present law. First, it would require that to the extent that any of the authorized 6,000 megawatt capacity remains unutilized, that the Secretary of the Treasury reallocate such excess capacity first to facilities that were placed in service before 2021, to the extent that those facilities had not already received an allocation equal to their nameplate capacity. And then any additional unutilized credit could be allocated to facilities placed in service after 2020 in the order in which such facilities are placed in service. And for that purpose, the placed in service date would be extended. The second change this legislation would make would allow qualified public entities, such as public power authorities, to elect to forego credits to which they would otherwise be entitled under present law in favor of an eligible project partner. That is, that they could allocate their share of any eligible credit to another taxpayer, such as the designer of the facility, the construction contractor of the facility, or a taxable owner of the facility. Both of these provisions would be effective upon the date of enactment. That concludes my brief description. Be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Are there any questions about the amendment and nature of substitute? Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Barthold, if the committee fails to adopt this legislation, when will this credit expire?
The credit doesn't expire per se. It's dependent upon when facilities are placed in service. So if a qualified facility is placed in service prior to 2021, the taxpayer is eligible for the credit.
So this addresses a problem.
It's 8 years. The credit's payable. I didn't say under present law the credit is payable for 8 years worth of production.
So this addresses the recurrent problem in the nuclear industry of never being on time or on budget.
Excuse me, Mr. Doggett?
This addresses a recurrent problem with the nuclear industry of never being on time or on budget on its projects. So it has to be, you're extending it so that they can qualify for plant that they said they would get in service long ago, but now they'll have until 2021 to get it in service.
This legislation would only extend the placed in service date if there is unutilized allocated credits when it comes to the beginning of 2021.
And while the sponsors emphasize the hope for advanced nuclear technologies and solving the problems this industry's never been able to solve in the past, won't this credit continue to be available to reactor designs that are over 20 years old?
The requirements for that were established when the legislation was enacted in 2005 were for designs that were approved post 1993.
So it could be it's not only about some as yet perhaps undreamed of design, but it's about a reactor design back to 1993 can qualify.
Congress's judgment in the early 2000s was to exclude reactor designs predating 1993.
15 or 17 years later, apparently the judgment's still the same in this bill. The other provision I'd like to ask you about is the last one you referred to, and that's the eligible project partners. Am I correct that an eligible project partner who could benefit here would include a uranium mining company?
I believe so, yes. Yes, sir.
And basically anyone in the supply chain could be eligible.
That's generally correct.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to question Mr. Barthold? Amendment and nature substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman and members, compared to the billions of dollars in public subsidies that have been wasted on the nuclear industry, this mere $16 million in additional public subsidy hardly merits a footnote. But I do want to record an objection and put this proposal in an appropriate context. I am surprised to hear that if the industry isn't eligible for another $16 million in public subsidies, it's going to be worse than Sherman's March on Atlanta and across Georgia in the impact there. The nuclear power industry decided that it needed special treatment in order to build new nuclear power plants. And in Georgia, for example, decades of utility law were turned upside down when utility company shareholders, instead of funding investments until they were used and useful to the utility consumer, business and individual, they changed that. And the nukes decided that that was just not sufficiently generous to them. They changed the law in Georgia so that customers would begin to pay for the investment before it ever generated a single kilowatt of power. It's part of a pattern of an industry that socializes cost to the public while retaining only the profits. In Georgia, this special unjustified change in utility law was just not sufficient because Westinghouse, a once distinguished blue ribbon company, has gone belly up. It's been nuked, and so have local utility ratepayers. As the New York Times reported recently, Many of the company's injuries are self-inflicted. Westinghouse's problems are already reducing Japan's footprint in nuclear power, an industry it has nurtured for decades in the name of security. Bankruptcy will make it harder for Westinghouse's business partners to collect money they are owed by the nuclear plant maker. That mostly affects the American power companies. Now it's unclear whether the company will be able to complete any of its projects, which in the United States are 3 years late and billions over budget. The cost estimates are already running $1 billion to $1.5 billion. Morgan Stanley says they could eventually reach, could exceed $8 billion overall. So it's not just a matter of avoiding another Fukushima-type human disaster. It's not just a realization that when the nuclear industry makes a mistake, a safety mistake, that nuclear is forever with all the associated potential harm to humans. It is a recognition that with ample natural gas and a growing renewable energy industry, nuclear often does not make economic sense unless it gets some special treatment and subsidies or public handouts. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter from a number of environmental groups expressing opposition to this legislation.
Without objection.
Now that they need this special extension leads to another concern, and that is why the nuclear industry is getting this little favor while other renewable tax credits in this committee languish. Bailing out the nuclear industry diverts public dollars that could be used for other investments in renewable energy. Our colleagues on a bipartisan basis, Tom Reed and Mike Thompson, have a bipartisan bill that would extend expired credits for expenditures on energy-efficient residential property, fuel cells, small wind energy, and geothermal heat pumps, legislation that I got included on heat pumps a decade ago, I believe. Mr. Pascrell has some related legislation. Mr. Larson has legislation that he's introduced in the past. All of these are forms of energy that would really lead us to a better place on energy resources and address climate change at the same time. I would put the focus on tax incentives like those our colleagues have offered that provide greater promise for safe, healthy forms of energy instead of an industry that costs too much and poses harm to too many. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I want to thank my two colleagues for bringing this piece of legislation forward today. It has a direct impact on the people of Greater Atlanta, including part of my congressional district. I'm prepared to support the piece of legislation and to vote for it.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Are there any amendments to the amendment of the nature of substitute?
I've got an amendment.
Yes. For what purpose does gentleman seek recognition?
I've got an amendment at the desk.
Yes, gentleman is recognized for purposes of offering his amendment. Mr. Reichert?
I reserve a point of order, Mr.
Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment, and I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes. Thank you. Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm offering the amendment that was just passed out along with my colleagues, Mr. Reed, Mr. Larson, and Mr. Meehan, to add our Technologies for Energy Security Act to the underlying bill. I intend to withdraw the amendment, but I want to take this opportunity to raise this important issue before the committee and the public. In 2015, then President Obama signed a bill into law that extended the solar investment tax credit for 5 years. The provision was part of a bill that I had, the New Energy for America Act. I introduced that bill because the investment tax credit, I believe, is one of the most important tools that we have to support the development of renewable energy technologies. And not only is expanding renewable energy good for our environment, it's good for job growth as well. The solar energy industry currently employs over 200,000 Americans at thousands of solar companies, and we're generating more solar energy than ever before. The policy is working. Unfortunately, the investment tax credit for other renewable technologies was not extended. The Technologies for Energy Security Act has 92 bipartisan co-sponsors, including members on both sides of this dais. Our amendment would extend the investment tax credit for renewable technologies that weren't included in the solar provision. Other technologies like geothermal and small wind are also important parts of the renewable energy mix. Across our country, people are using renewable technologies like small wind or combined heat and power systems. Businesses and homeowners in all of our districts are doing impressive and innovative things with renewable energy because it makes economic and environmental sense. I want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Reed, Mr. Larson, and Mr. Meehan, Mr. Chairman, for their work on this, and I would withdraw my amendment.
Prior to withdrawal, would the gentleman from Pennsylvania wish to be recognized? Speak on the amendment?
Yes.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the sentiment from the gentleman from California, and that I recognize he will withdraw his motion, but I would like to speak for a moment to discuss the investment tax credit for combined heat and power, fuel cells, and micro turbines. I know this is an issue without some political sensitivity, but these are technologies that almost exclusively create American jobs. They're reliable sources of power for customers independent of weather conditions. They've gone from development of commercialization to play a vital role in ensuring that all of our constituents enjoy reliable, resilient, and affordable energy. We have strong bipartisan support for this bill. There are more than 10,000 fuel cell employees across this country, and they are good-paying jobs. If we don't address this issue at some point in time, my fear is that we're going to deal a serious blow to an American manufacturing and threaten industries that are providing resilient, efficient, alternative energy technologies. We are trying to give these technologies some of the treatment that we have given solar. And I conclude again by saying that this is an opportunity for us to preserve and create jobs and provide a affordable, diverse energy mix, and it also has provided a diverse mix among our colleagues with support on both sides of the aisle. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in favor of this, and I hope my colleagues from both sides, if it's not something that can be resolved today, will continue to work on this issue so that we can assure that we protect these jobs in this industry.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan. Mr. Larson, if I may.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Meehan. I also would like to acknowledge my support for the underlying bill and the remarks of Mr. Rice and Mr. Blumenauer, Mr. Lewis as well. I think it's a good bill, and I think it's intuitively obvious about its importance and the jobs that are at stake here for both South Carolina and Georgia. I would also add that with the amendment that has been offered and is agreed to be withdrawn, that there are substantial jobs at stake in the fuel cell technology in my district and around this country, to the total of about 3,000 in Connecticut and 10,000 across the country. And that's why it's a particular concern. And Mr. Chairman, I hope we have, since as Mr. Thompson has pointed out, that there are over 93 co-sponsors, including 54 Republicans, 8 of whom are on the Ways and Means Committee, who understand the importance and significance of this, that we have an opportunity to work with you to bring this important legislation to the forefront that However, the history or the lore goes in this building was either inadvertently or intentionally left out when tax credits were being applied in a previous session. Whether that's myth or truth or whatever is not important to me. What's important are the jobs that are at stake and the importance of this value-added industry. Mr. Rice singled out the real enemy here, and that enemy is carbon, one that Mr. Blumenauer addressed as well. It's my sincere hope that this committee will finally step up, as is our role, and address the whole issue of taxing dirty energy and taxing carbon in general, and coming up, therefore, with the ability to make room for the tax proposals that we want and the infrastructure that's going to be necessary for us in order to rebuild this country and put everyone back to work. I can only hope, Mr. Chairman, again, that because of the importance of fuel cell technology, its innovation, that we do not, as Mr. Rice so eloquently stated before, cede a technology to China and to Korea. This is something that we ought to take advantage of in this committee. It's a proven technology. It's a clean technology. It's an alternative that should have been included. I respect the spirit here today to withdraw this, but I hope, given the number of members on this committee that feel so strongly about this, that we can work with the chairman to bring this forward.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. Martin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard, I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill and speak strongly in favor of it. We've heard today about the jobs in Georgia and South Carolina, but I have a major company in my district that is severely affected by this industry, and it's a big job saver in my district because they're vitally interested and involved in these projects, and I'd like to enter a statement on the record.
Without objection. So ordered. Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Thank you. Just briefly, this issue has been around for a long time now. And Mr. Chairman, I really think it would be well for us, under your leadership, to sit down with the help of Mr. Neal and the rest of us to really decide whether we're going to have the opportunity to resolve this. It's been much too long. It was left out, and I don't think we do well in this committee when something's left out to simply kind of let it be abandoned through inaction. So I really appeal for us, with so many sponsors on both sides of the aisle in this committee, that we sit down and have a serious discussion about the future of these renewables. Renewables are more and more becoming a key part of the energy picture, and I think our committee, Mr. Chairman, has the obligation to discuss this. And then we can decide its fate.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Does anyone else wish to speak before withdrawal? I'll make a point here. Look, I'm sort of to the point that each of you have made, and Mr. Meehan's point as well. I know there are a number of members here that are strong, effective advocates for this provision, making the case for importance and parity going forward. My hope is that we can address this in a positive way this year in comprehensive tax reform, and we will continue to work with each of you because we understand the urgency and the importance of this provision. With that, Mr. Thompson wishes to withdraw. Are there any further amendments? Seeing none. Excuse me, Mr. Pascarelli, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I do support the underlying piece of legislation, but I have an amendment. We all have different priorities.
Yeah.
Offshore wind development is an industry.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wright, if the gentleman would suspend for a moment.
I'm sorry.
I reserve a point of order.
So Mr. Reichert reserves a point of order. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes. So, Mr. Pasquarello, you're recognized for purposes of offering your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, the U.S. Department of Energy estimates that by 2030, offshore wind projects in the United States could create more than 43,000 permanent operations and maintenance jobs, and approximately 20.7 thousand direct jobs per annual megawatt. And it keeps us competitive. Countries like China and Denmark are investing heavily in offshore wind, enough to power the equivalent of 10 million and 13 million U.S. homes by 2020. Furthermore, offshore wind is good for consumers' wallets, with zero fuel cost and fixed prices for 20 years or more. Offshore wind is clean, protects public health, reduces our carbon footprint. When operating, it creates no air or water pollution, does not deplete freshwater resources, requires no mining, transportation, or refining. It can provide clean electric power to major United States cities that face air quality challenges that threaten public health. That's a fact. We can ignore it, think it's going to go away on its own, or do something about it. I think both sides want to do something about it. But higher startup costs and long investment time make offshore wind challenges unique. Having a megawatt threshold for the ITC for offshore wind instead of a timeline would be a more effective policy to incent offshore wind development and encourage companies to take on the upfront costs. My amendment would base the credit on the first 3,000 megawatts placed in service rather than years as the current ITC does. I ask us to look at that principle, which may be applicable to other forms of energy. It's a common sense incentive for our economy, for our environment, and for our tax policy. I hope that it will be considered by this committee, Mr. Chairman, in the future, and I will withdraw the amendment if I have to.
Gentleman withdraws the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Pasquarello. Are there additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? If there are none, the question is on the adoption amendment in the nature of substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Riker for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1551 as amended to the House of Representatives.
So the question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5051 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1551 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. And without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Then members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business for the committee stands adjourned.